Hey guys, it's Dr. May. How are you? Well, hope you're doing good today. I want to talk a little bit more about validation and invalidation. Now, I already have a video about validation and what it is, but this one's kind of going into some examples of what happens when we grow up and certain of our normal childhood characteristics are either validated or invalidated by our family and others, and how that could then present itself in us right now, and also what we could do about it. Okay, so that's today's theme. And I bet you'll be able to recognize yourself in this one, okay? Because a lot of this sounds pretty familiar, I'm sure. All right, here we go. Okay, I might be changing this title for YouTube just to make it simpler, but basically, again, I'm gonna go over some normal childhood characteristics that we all have while we're growing up, and how were they handled? Were they validated and invalidated, and what happens when that's the case? Okay, so here we go. All right, so just, whoopsie, sorry, quick review. So validation is basically putting yourself in someone else's shoes. So in this case, how well was your parent able to put him or herself in your shoes when you were growing up? So how did your parents understand you as a child who was growing up? How well did they understand your needs and your wants and your feelings, right? And were they able to do that and communicate to you how just your normal childhood characteristics made sense, given that you were a kid, and how some of your unique qualities made sense, right? Especially given your age and what was going on with you and everything else, okay? On the other hand, invalidation is much more like when they don't really understand it. They don't fully understand your developmental needs. They didn't really understand your emotions. Maybe they told you you were wrong about certain things. Maybe they forced you to grow up faster than you were ready to, or kept you younger longer than you needed to. They could have outright been verbally abusive or emotionally abusive, insulting you, criticizing you, judging you, blaming you, telling you you're wrong for what you're feeling. So all these kinds of things are invalidation, all right? So just keep these definitions in mind as we go along, because all the examples are going to talk about what happens if you're validated versus invalidated, okay? All right, so first characteristic that we all have when we're young is that we're valuable. Just because we're human beings, we're valuable, okay? And ever walk into a room when you're a kid and you kind of light up the room and all the adults are just glad to see you? That's like a sign that they feel you're valuable, right? That they treat you like you're a respected member of the family and that you have a sense of inherent worth, okay? So that's what happens when your valuable features are validated. Okay, so what happens when you're invalidated? So you end up growing up in polarizing. So either you feel like you're not valuable at all and you feel like you're less than other people, right? So maybe there's a shame kind of feeling, or you just don't feel important, or you have like low self-esteem and you feel like I'm just not as good as other people, I'm not good enough, right? So that's what happens in part when you're not treated like you're valuable. Otherwise, you could overcompensate and you could become more like an arrogant, kind of grandiose presentation and act like you're better than everybody. So it's like the flip side of feeling invaluable, right? So you could be one or both, right? Sometimes you might feel like a piece of crap, and other times you might feel like you're great, or you feel great until you're like slighted by somebody, and then all of a sudden you swing the other way and you feel like a piece of crap, right? So this could be part of the outcome if your valuable nature is not validated, okay? So it's hard to develop appropriate levels of self-esteem and self-worth. Okay, so let's look at vulnerable, right? So, I mean, all human beings are essentially vulnerable, but especially children, right? Because children can't take care of themselves. They need caretakers to take care of their needs, right? They don't have adequate coping skills yet. They need guidance in a lot of things in life, right? They're still developing, right? So vulnerable is a normal childhood characteristic, right? So if your vulnerability was respected and recognized, then your parents were able to protect you instead of leaving you out to the wolves, right? So if you're vulnerable and not protected, you could feel like, you know, the very, very endangered in the world, right? So your parents were able to protect you when necessary, but also as you develop, slowly guide you toward doing more on your own so that you could take care of yourself and not feel as vulnerable, right? So there's a little bit of a balance, like kind of a pushing toward development, toward less vulnerability as you get older in an appropriate manner, okay? All right, so what happens if vulnerability is invalidated? Well, you might never get out of your vulnerability. You might always have this feeling like I'm too vulnerable. And because of that, you might not be able to protect yourself when you need to. So you might unwittingly get yourself into situations where maybe you're taken advantage of, or people are hurting you in some way because you don't know how to protect yourself. You never learned because your parent didn't guide you to do that, right? So that could be a problem if you walk through the world too vulnerable, right? On the other hand, you could go the flip side again and act like you're invulnerable. Like nothing's gonna hurt me, right? I'm totally fine. I have this armor on, I put these walls up, and I don't have any problems or weaknesses. I'm totally okay, right? Or you could flip back and forth, okay? Recognize anything? Sound familiar? Okay. Another thing is that naturally, everybody's imperfect, okay? We're just imperfect human beings, and we make mistakes throughout our life. And especially when we're young, we're just learning, right? We're just growing up. We make mistakes all the time, right? We mess up socially, we mess up in school, we misbehave sometimes. We're just imperfect, right? We're flawsome, okay? And if your parent validates that, then they recognize that mistakes are okay and you can just learn from them. That, you know, punish the sin but not the sinner, so to speak. That they could help you correct your mistakes but still let you feel like you're a valuable human being, right? That not like you make a mistake and it's the worst thing in the world and you're worthless now, right? That mistakes were handled appropriately and you're still loved even with your mistakes. Okay, so that's a validated response. Invalidated. Well, it's pretty much when your imperfections are not okay. So when they feel like it's terrible to make a mistake and that means something bad about you, this is what could happen. You might end up saying, all right, well, you think I'm no good because I make mistakes? I'll show you how no good I really am. And it might lead you to some negative behaviors, rebellion, acting out, because it's like, why even try? Nothing I do is good enough, so I might as well swing totally the other way and just, act out and do whatever. Okay. So I put quote unquote bad because no one's really bad. That's a judgment, but it might manifest as negative behavior. On the other hand, you might always be constantly striving to prove that you're good enough. Because if I feel like if I finally prove that I'm okay, if I'm perfect, maybe people will finally love and accept me. And so there's a constant, endless striving to be more and more perfect, thinking that that's going to be the key to get love. And so that could be the other side. And the fear is like, if I don't, I'm going to be bad, right? So it swings back and forth, kind of like the other ones. All right. Next, dependent. Naturally, kids are dependent. You need caregivers, you need parents. You're not normally expected to take care of yourself, right? And so dependency needs need to be respected, right? So when they're validated, your parents give you care. They understand your need for affection, for protection, for love, for help, right? And they provide it to you in a developmentally appropriate way. And at the same time, as you get older, they're slowly guiding you toward a little bit greater independence, helping you figure out ways to take care of yourself and your needs while also providing support and care, right? So an appropriate balance, age dependent, all right? But invalidated, maybe your parents resented your dependency. They didn't like you being too needy or too dependent on them or too needy of their help or their care. Maybe they just couldn't be bothered. It was too overwhelming, right? Little kids can be very overwhelming. They need a lot, right? So if your dependency needs were invalidated and you were made to feel wrong for having needs, it could swing one of two ways. One is that you never get over dependency needs and you continue to be dependent on people even into adulthood. So this might manifest in relationships with friends, with partners, and you might have a very clingy, needy, dependent style. And you might feel like it's never enough, like you're a bottomless pit. And no matter how much people try to show you they care, it never feels like enough. And that's because your dependency needs weren't cared for properly when you were young. And it could be very painful in adulthood because you feel like you're always lacking. And it might mess up your relationships because people get tired of it. They feel useless because they can't help you enough. They can't love you enough, right? So that's how dependency needs could possibly manifest later. On the other hand, you could become what they call anti-dependent, right? Not just independent, like, I'm fine doing things by myself sometimes. It's kind of like such an aversion to dependence that it's like anti-dependent, right? Like, I don't have any needs. I don't need anything from you people. I don't need anyone. I'm fine. I don't need help with anything, right? And it's like a fear of dependency almost, right? And a lack of trust. And the fear is like, if I try to trust somebody, they're just going to invalidate my dependency needs. So I'm just going to not need anybody. Okay. So again, it could be one or both of these things. Okay. And finally, immature. Of course you're immature if you're a kid, right? That's just what kids are. They haven't grown up yet. And sometimes parents are more or less patient with you being immature. And if they're patient with it, they understand that you're growing up, you're not mature yet. You can be silly sometimes. You can be annoying sometimes. You can have, neediness sometimes. You could be overcome by emotions sometimes, but they're patient with that. They show an understanding while at the same time help to move you toward maturity slowly in an appropriate way. Okay, so validated needs from immaturity. Uh, if it's invalidated, maybe they get too sick of you being immature. They're not very understanding of that. They get nasty with you or hurt you or make fun of you or demean you if you're acting immature. And so you may never fully grow up. Or maybe they weren't good models for you of acting mature, right? That could be possible too. So you can get stuck in your immaturity. And in a chaotic sense, it could be like you're always an emotional mind. Your emotions haven't really, your ability to manage your emotions hasn't matured. So you might get more overwhelmed by emotions. You might act in an immature way in your relationships, kind of become more childlike sometimes. Sometimes adults, even though they look like adults, they act a little like children. So, it's like an immature presentation. Like some people I've met, they find out they're 35 and it's like, really? I thought this person was 22. Oh my God. Like they just act very young, right? So you might get stuck in a lower stage because you weren't helped to move past it because your immaturity wasn't validated. On the other hand, you might have been a parentified child. You weren't allowed to be a child and be silly and be needy. And your parent was the one who was suffering, and you felt the need to parent your child, to be your parent's confidant, or to help calm down an angry parent and keep the parent okay so that you could survive. So your adaptation was to grow up before your time and to be too mature and never had a chance to go through being the silly kid that you wanted to be because no one was allowing you to do that. So when you're an adult, you might continue to have that controlling nature because that's what helped you when you were young. So people might call you bossy, they may call you controlling, you might caretake too much, whether people are asking for it or not, because that's what made you feel esteemed when you were young. It's how you're adapted to people not respecting your immaturity. Okay, so I'm not sure if any of these sound familiar to you, but it might, at least some of these, right? Okay, so what do we do now? So basically, if those normal childhood characteristics were not validated then, you could start to provide yourself with a lot of the validation now. So looking at yourself and the way your behavior manifests now, you could validate the fact that it got this way because your needs were not validated earlier on. So you could understand, well, I get it. This is why I'm acting this way, or this is why I'm acting that way. So that's a start, right? Demonstrating that understanding to yourself. But also recognizing that those characteristics still are okay. A lot of them still make sense even as adults because we're still human beings. So we can remind ourselves that just because we're human, we're already enough. We don't have to keep proving ourselves. We could work toward our goals without having to be perfectionistic. And we are valuable. And we could recognize that and surround ourselves with people that recognize our value now, okay, to make up for what we didn't get before. Also, it's still okay to be vulnerable. Not that we want to stay so vulnerable that we can't protect ourselves, but at times we are vulnerable. When we feel certain emotions, we feel vulnerable. Under certain stresses, we're vulnerable. Physically, we can catch illnesses and other things can happen and we're vulnerable. So we could respect our own vulnerability and know that's just part of being human. And we don't have to run from it. We could embrace it. Okay. Next, being imperfect. Normally, as human beings, everybody's imperfect. And you could still be okay and be imperfect. And in fact, sometimes people like you better if you're okay with your imperfection. Some of the most endearing people are the people that are okay with admitting to mistakes and laughing about them and stuff like that. So we could all strive to work on that now. Instead of being, let's say, dependent as an adult, which might be not always something that works out very well, we could strive toward being what they say is interdependent. So it's kind of like we lean on each other just because we're social human beings. And so understanding that that's okay, that I could lean on other people, but also take care of myself. And I don't have to actively avoid one or the other. All right. So understanding that healthy balance as an adult could help us right now. And while we don't want to be quote unquote immature if we're a grown up, we could allow ourselves to be playful or silly or have emotions sometimes or, have a bad day once in a while, but then pick ourselves back up again. Okay. So having that balance of allowing a different range of experience within ourselves is okay. Right. So those are all things we could do right now to make up for the past. Okay. But being aware of all these things does help, right? So knowing that these things might have happened for you and how you can then be aware of them now gives you some tools to work on it. All right. So that's it. Hope this helps, and thanks for listening. And I'll see you again soon. All right. Bye, everybody.